Fantasia had always been my favorite of Walt's movies. Walt said, Fantasia is the best idea I ever had because it's an endless project.
Fantasia 2000 was the continuation of Walt's vision of having this ever-changing film that would always be going out there with new pieces in it. While I was working on that project, Roy said, let's do one of the interstitials on the Disney that never was.
Destino was one of those that there was a lot of artwork produced, but never a film. So I went and got a few pieces of art.
Each piece you looked at, you were just, holy smokes, this is unbelievable. And you just put that aside, and here comes another piece that's even more magnificent.
We'd had it for 50 years, gathering dust. Something went ding in my head, and I thought, well, wait a minute, what if we make the film now?
The next thing you knew, we were being charged with finishing Destino.
Walt really trusted John Hench to understand what he wanted. By putting John Hench in with Dolly, it was as close as Walt could get to putting himself in with Dolly on a day-to-day basis.
It may have something to do, but my French, he thought would help. My French wasn't any worse than his English.
Dolly was given free rein to come up with the subject.
And the project they decided to collaborate on was an animation of a Mexican folk song, which Walt had scored at the studio called Destino.
Dolly selected the title because he was interested in destiny. He thought the music must be good.
Personal contact between Dolly and Walt Disney occurred around 1945 when he was working on Spellbound. They met at a party at Jack Warner's. He was painting Jack Warner's wife's portrait at the time, Anne Warner. He also painted Jack Warner's portrait, and Jack Warner looked at it and put it in the dog kennel.
Walt was totally intrigued with this guy when he met him, and Salvador Dali was totally intrigued with Walt Disney, and they hit it off very well right from the very beginning.
Disney and Dali have a conversation about, gee, wouldn't it be great to work together? And sure enough, Walt Disney follows through, and a contract was drawn up.
Dolly came in and they made a deal to produce a short subject.
And in early 1946, Dolly starts to report to the studio every day. Dolly would make basic drawings of the story as he saw it, based on the music of Destino. And then John would try to find continuity within that, from one image to another.
He had the concept in his head. It changed sometimes, all right, but the difficulty he had was getting from one sequence to another, and that was my job.
Dolly never had that kind of a discipline on him. He did what he did purely because that's who he was and it was his art.
He usually set the mood and the setting and the props, as it were, to indicate what he thought the message was in each sequence. Then I had to take over with the same setup and try and work out some way of getting to the next one. And that seemed to satisfy him.
They did lots of story sketches. Dolly would come in every day, sometimes with completely new ideas, and Walt loved that he did that. Walt loved that he would take things off into new directions. And then there was John Hench left trying to tie everything together and make something cohesive out of it.
Fantasia was being made at the time of a real creative peak for the studio and for Walt Disney himself. The idea was to make the film just as rich and as beautiful and as evocative as it could possibly be, and then make it even better than that.
We really don't know very much about Hermann Schultheiss. He was born in Germany. He was an amateur anthropologist, archaeologist.
Schultheiss started at the studio early in 1938 to work in the process lab. He was there for about a year and then moved in early 1939 into the special effects department, which was just starting to blossom with a lot of new camera techniques.
Schultheiss was sort of a jack of all trades, so he was quite perfect to come and work on Fantasia. He was brought on to help in the creation of contraptions that would augment the special effects.
He determined on his own to document what he was doing. And so he started out to do this notebook as a way of recording all of the technical details of how these specific effects were accomplished. And when they'd come to a problem that had never been tackled before and find a unique solution for it, they would take apart their equipment once that shot was done. So if he had not recorded all of this, we really wouldn't have any idea how some of those effects were done.
There's a picture in the Schultheis notebook of Vesuvius exploding in 1933, and it's taken by Schultheis.
Actual volcano eruption photographs taken on one of my trips to Italy. Having been inside the crater of an erupting volcano, I was able to give valuable information.
They created this skyline of volcanic shapes and then suspended it upside down in a water tank.
Cups on hinges drop white paint in water.
They flipped the image back right side up, and it made a realistic picture of smoke. They went to tremendous effort and some expense to create this thing, and if you look very, very quickly, you can catch a glimpse of it in the finished film.
In 1955, a very strange thing happens to Herman. He was an inveterate traveler. He went on a trip to Guatemala, and he was last seen walking into the jungle with his camera and a pocket knife.
And that's the last anyone ever heard of him. His widow lived on, I believe, into her 90s.
And when she died, she willed the house to a nursing order of nuns. And among the contents were several books autographed to Herman Schultheis by Walt Disney. They brought in Howard Lowry, who is an expert on Disneyana and animation art. They went into the bedroom, and there was a Murphy bed that they pulled down, and there in a little space were the notebooks.
In the very beginning, we had no animation art, nothing.
There weren't a lot of examples of original animation art in the collection because Walt never took those things home with him. So the family began a really arduous process of collecting what you see here in the museum.
We had to acquire everything, and we had to have it to make this museum what it's supposed to be, and we are still acquiring it.
Walt was so important to culture in the 20th century, so it's really gratifying to be able to make all of these objects and photographs and works of art come alive.
What my grandpa was most proud of with his studio is putting together a great team of people that helped him bring his ideas and his vision to reality. And I think this museum is a great collaboration of very talented and creative men and women.
Alibaba and the 40 Thieves comes from the Arabian Nights. The idea was to use the music Sherazade by Rimsky-Korsakov.
Well, he would do a pastel, and then he would get his camera and he would shoot his master shot of the whole thing, then go in and shoot little individual pieces, close-up of one of the characters, then maybe another two-shot over here, and so forth. And he would take these slides, and then he would be able to tell you a story.
I remember going to a screening of Musicana, and by screening I mean it was kind of an early presentation. It was Mel with a tray of slides of his artwork that he had photographed. He would drop a needle on a vinyl record album, and he'd get this feeling of what the movie could be. I think that was the genius of Mel.
The African piece was called The Wren God, and it told the story of a monkey that stole a diamond from the Wren God. Most of the concept art was developed by Ken Anderson.
Ken was probably one of the most influential single artists at the studio all through his tenure from the 40s into the 60s.
Ken Anderson was like Mel Shaw. They both brought so much to each production. The way he drew the characters, even the animators took cues on the design.
Musicana was kind of a follow-up on Fantasia, only we wanted it to be different. I had the idea of doing some shorts that would be from various countries with the musicians of that country.
When you walked into Mel's office, he had huge storyboards blanketed with pen and ink, pastel drawings, basically he had pretty much blocked out different sequences of musicana.
I also had access to the music library, so anything I thought would fit, I would get it out and give them an idea of how I thought the music should be and so forth.
One sequence that Mel Shaw explored for Musicana is the sequence about jazz in the south of the U.S. The music would have been a song by Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong.
You have Louis Armstrong, who's a great, great artist, one of the founders of jazz in America, and you start to see this story come to life with frogs on lily pads pulling out their trumpets and handkerchiefs, and the whole party getting messed up at the end by a stern wheeler going by. All the frogs surfing waves into the shore, and it was really a Fantasia sequence in every way except a chance to take a hit off of a more modern, contemporary artist. Mel Shaw's an interesting artist. One of the styles that he brought to the studio was really unique. He worked in pastels, which are colored chalks, basically, and he would have a shop vac in one hand and take off some of the chalk with his shop vac and come in with another one and kind of draw on top of it and create these beautiful drawings. When you put it under a camera and you light it, so you have lights coming in from the side, the chalk absolutely glows. It gives you colors and luminance that you just don't get with a painting.
Walt was trying to create a perfect world, I suppose.
Walt was always about this notion that you could return to some sort of idealized place. For Walt, the idealized place was Marceline, Missouri, where he spent a few years of his very young life. It was a farm town, and he was only there for a handful of years. But those were seminal years for him. Years he remembered very, very, very fondly. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch, psychologically, to say that Walt Disney spent the better part of his life trying to either recreate Marceline in various ways, either in animation or physically, as he does in Main Street at Disneyland. That sense of home, that sense of place, that sense of peace, that sense of security.
When you come in the main gate, past the railroad station, straight ahead lies the heartline of America. Hometown USA, just after the turn of the century.